The Rocky Mountain National Park is our topic this week. I use it as our topic because it's close to most of us and or most of us have heard of it. Rocky Mountain National Park is our topic because we're talking about land use this week. Land use took the center stage in politics in Colorado between about 1862 and 1891. It had always been part of our topic, but not in the way that we're going to be talking about it this week. So why did it become a part of our dialogue during this time period? Well, as we know from last week, the Homestead Act was passed in 1862. It brought a lot of people to Colorado. Some of those people, however, didn't choose to use the Homestead Act to farm, as we will learn this week. Instead, they took advantage of the Homestead Act in a way that maybe federal government had not thought of. So we'll talk about what that looked like this week. The Homestead Act, if you recall, was a way that people could basically buy and use land by proving it up in a way that was pretty affordable. So people who had money were easily able to do this. However, what happened is that the federal government started to acknowledge that people were taking advantage of the Homestead Act and began to fear what that meant for our country. A lot of people started to basically use the land to cut down the natural resources, like in the Rocky Mountain National Park, the trees. Other things that were of use to people were the land so that they could use it for tourism, as we see in the Rocky Mountain National Park. So in 1891, the federal government passed the Forest Reserve Act. What that was an act to basically protect the watershed and preserve timber for our nation. Unfortunately, the Forest Reserve Act did not have a lot behind it, and there wasn't a lot of regulation, and many people still took advantage of the land. So in 1897, we see the Forest Management Act passed. And what that did is it allowed us to enforce a lot of what the Forest Reserve Act was trying to do, which was to protect certain areas of land, like we see with the BLM, the Bureau of Land Management, so that we can conserve some of our natural resources for later use. We're going to talk about land use in the context of the Rocky Mountain National Park. And you can see that basically what started to happen is there was an acknowledgement that different people had different ideas of land use during this time period. We see basically the big divide is, do we use land as a way to have profit, or do we use land because it is a place for us to get away, to respect, to rejuvenate? Well, different people obviously had different ideas about what that might look like. The people that started to use the land, the Rocky Mountain National Park specifically, for profit were people like Joel Estes. Joel Estes was an early rancher who came in and took advantage of the Homestead Act. He basically claimed land, started to ranch on the land, and he would sell his meat down in Denver, along with the furs that he would get from elk and different things. So Joel Estes is one of those gentlemen who took advantage of the Homestead Act and made a pretty good profit from it. Another guy who took advantage of the Homestead Act up in Estes Park is the Earl of Dunraven. Many of you may know that there is a restaurant named the Dunraven Inn, and that is named after the Earl of Dunraven. Because what the Earl of Dunraven did is he came into Estes Park and he bought up a whole lot of land. He actually proved up the land, however, though, under the Homestead Act. Several 160-acre plots of land right in what we know today as the Rocky Mountain National Park. He was basically going to build a lot of tourist resorts so that people could come and visit Estes Park. And he saw Estes Park as a place where the rich could come and get away from places like Denver. Over time, however, people grew suspicious of the Dunraven, and he had to sell off a lot of his land, and or the land was taken from him. One of those gentlemen was a man named F.O. Stanley. F.O. Stanley came to Estes Park because of his poor health. We will learn later that many people eventually come to Colorado because of their poor health. They believe that diseases like tuberculosis can be cured because of our dry air, and that a lot of ways to cure it involved basically sleeping out in our cold, fresh air. F.O. Stanley came in the early 1900s. You can see that's about 40 years after the Homestead Act. He came during a time that our nation's middle class was growing. The railways were becoming very established, and people were basically having the money at that period of time to be able to come in to Colorado, go from Denver, use cars even from Denver to go up to places like Estes Park for vacations. This is a huge change from what life used to be. So the middle class was a big factor in allowing people to start to take advantage of the tourist industry. People outside, that is, the higher elite class. So in 1904, Stanley builds the infamous Stanley Hotel, what many people know as the place where The Shining was filmed, and is kind of known for its ghost in and out of the hotel. So that hotel is a pretty amazing place when it's built. It has a place for planes to land eventually. It's got a bowling alley. It's got a lot of amenities that are still present today, along with that huge, beautiful hotel. So those are some examples of how Estes Park was used to make profit. However, we have another view of what Estes Park is, and that is the view of Native Americans. Many Native Americans, specifically the Ute, would come through Estes Park, the Rocky Mountain National Park, during different times of the years for different events. They would come during the summer solstice for a ritual event, and they would also have vision quests up in the Rocky Mountain National Park. You can read more about vision quests, but very quickly, vision quests are a way for people to kind of find themselves and who they are in the world. Another group of people that was becoming really big during this time were nature enthusiasts. These people, some people you can see down below, were like Emerson, Thoreau, or Muir, and these are people you probably have heard of. Some of you may have also heard of Enos Mills. Enos Mills is famous in our neck of the woods because he is the father of the Rocky Mountain National Park. Enos Mills enters into the Rocky Mountain National Park when he's a very young boy. He comes here much like F.O. Stanley to try to escape tuberculosis when he's very young. So he comes and works for some of his family. He actually winters up in Montana in some of the mines, and he comes back here during the summer and eventually leads tours in the Rocky Mountain National Park. Of course, when he's little, it's not known as the Rocky Mountain National Park, but that's how his enthusiasm and his love for the area grows. So Enos Mills happens to grow up during a time where there's a national dialogue starting to take place about what do we do with places like Estes Park, which have scenery and resources basically that a lot of people are taking advantage of, but some people have a strong respect for. So Enos Mills enters this national dialogue that's taking place, and the dialogue is basically between people called preservationists and conservationists. So preservationists believe that nature is a sacred place. It's some place that you go to recuperate, to rejuvenate, and like John Muir, he believes that it should be left unchanged, that people can go and visit, but we shouldn't take any sort of natural resources from it. We shouldn't change it in any way, that it's almost like a cathedral for people to go and visit. Other people, like Pinochet and Teddy Roosevelt, are conservationists. They are kind of the opposing view at the time. Conservationists believe that there should be a balance between man and nature, that we should be able to use some of the resources, but at the same time we should protect those resources for future use, so not use all the resources at one time. Their view, some people would say, was that of the lower and middle class and trying to protect them. Preservationists, however, some people might view as an elitist view, where they're not really taking into consideration what is the greatest good for the greatest number of people for the longest time. So that's something that I think is an interesting point to explore, and that we may explore a little bit more in our discussion this week. So what happens to Enos Mills is that he actually gets taken under the wing of John Muir. John Muir, remember, is a preservationist. And Enos Mills starts to basically listen to him, believe that that's the best way to go with the Rocky Mountain National Park, and he joins the preservationist movement. Enos Mills then begins to start lecturing around the United States in an effort to preserve and protect the Rocky Mountain National Park. He is joined by a lot of women's group, elitist organizations who support him, and eventually we have the creation of the Rocky Mountain National Park on January 26, 1915. So this week we'll be looking more at this idea of preservation versus conservation, the idea of nature as a sacred landscape versus nature as a place for people to visit and enjoy.